It's that God is actually taking portions off of his own plate that you could inherit it with him. He's given you, and here's the crazy part, it's not even that he's taking portions off of something he owns. The portion is himself. Jesus gives himself to you as a portion.
Welcome to the Reach College Podcast with your speaker, Pastor Taylor Gabbert.
Who in here has read the actual, Brothers Grimm fairy tales? Anybody? Pretty messed up, right? If you've ever read the actual ones, they're not the Disney versions. Okay, some crazy stuff happens. Go read Cinderella, and you'll immediately know what I'm talking about. But there's more than also the kind of the famous ones. There's a bunch of obscure ones, and I was looking at one this week. It was called the Fisherman and His Wife, or the Fisherman's Wife, something like that. It was a story about this fisherman, and you'll immediately be able to tell why this has never become a Disney film. It's not a highly compelling plot line, but this fisherman, he essentially catches a fish that turns out to be a magical prince fish, and he basically, the magical fish begs for his life and says, "Please let me go, put me back in the water, and I'll grant you wishes." And the fisherman is like, okay. Well, he turns out to be kind of almost a really kind-hearted person, and so he just lets this fish go, and he doesn't ask for anything in return. He just lets him go, right? Good person. Well, he goes home that day and he recounts what happened to his wife, and she immediately gets mad at him. She's like, "You tell me you had a magical wish-granting fish in your possession and you just didn't ask for anything?" She's like, "Go back and ask this fish for a better house. We live in this hut because you're a fisherman, and we could use so much more," right? So he goes back, and he calls for the fish, and the fish comes to him because he owes him his life, and he comes up and he asks the fish. He says, I want a bigger house, a nicer house, maybe some servants, like maid and cook, right? I want some things in the house. And he goes home, and sure enough, there it is. Massive house. Wife's just sitting in it. She's got all these servants attending to her. Things have improved massively, right? And after a very short amount of time, the fisherman's wife, she starts to realize she still has problems. Even though she got this much better house, she starts to focus on the things that are still wrong in her life, and she starts getting annoyed and fixated, and she goes, "Go back there and ask that fish for a castle. We need a bigger house with more servants." So it goes back, and apparently magical fish don't have the same rules as genies. There's more than 3 wishes are granted. So this goes on several iterations, right? He goes back and he gets the castle. Well, then same thing happens. His wife starts to fixate on their problems. She starts to think, "Man, this isn't good enough. Go back and ask that fish to make me a queen, because all the problems I still have I could solve if I just had a little bit of authority. If I could control some things," right? So he goes back and he asks, when he comes home, his wife is royalty. Now she's in charge of a kingdom and she can call the shots. What happens? She begins to have more problems. She fixates on those problems, and she's upset about how those things are going. And she says, "You know what I really need? I also need some religious sway. I need to be able to command people at the spiritual level. So go back and ask that fish to make me a priestess queen." So he goes back and he asks the fish, and the fish does it. And this is the final iteration, because he goes back, and sure enough, same thing happens. She begins to fixate on her problems and be ungrateful for everything that's happened. I mean, just the fact that her life has improved this massively. And she finally sends her husband back, and she says, "You know what? Just go ask that fish to make me a god." And he goes back and he asks the fish, and the fish just says, "Just go home and be with your wife." And when he gets home, they're back in the hut, and they have lost everything, because what at no point was she grateful. Was she focusing on the blessings? Did she see how much her life has improved? It turns out that she was the same person at every iteration of blessing. Nothing changed. She was just hyper fixated on all of her problems and trying to figure out how she could attain more wealth, more power to control those problems. This is actually just the basis of human nature. This is what we do. We constantly ignore all of the blessings in our life, and we actually just focus on the things that aren't perfect. As if there's ever going to be a state where you have enough money or enough power or enough fame or influence where everything can be perfect for you and nothing will go wrong. And that's not the way it works, and that's essentially what people are chasing. You've ever heard the phrase, we should count our blessings? Or how about where the Bible just says, make known your requests with thanksgiving? Right? Because the Bible teaches us that there's a certain mentality in your heart, one of contentment, that can acknowledge that you have need, acknowledge that you have problems, and still focus correctly on all the things that God is doing for you and how God is there for you. There's a story, old adage about a dog with a bone, right? The dog is walking along and has this nice big bone, and he's perfectly happy with it. And eventually, he looks into a lake and he sees the reflection of another dog with a bigger bone. And he gets jealous and he drops his bone in the lake because he wants to get the bone that this other dog has, and now he has nothing. Right? That's essentially how we act with blessings. We're never focused on the blessings we already have, but instead we want more, and we end up missing out on or losing what we already have. The goal of this is to not be focused on the world. It is to focus on what you have and not miss that God has given you treasure, that God has given you something that you already have access to. He's already made it available to you, and He wants you to have this treasure and enjoy it. So we're in a Genesis series called The March of Redemption, and we've moved into the Joseph narratives. So we start out with Joseph makes his brothers angry, and he gets sold into slavery, right? He goes, and at some point he's falsely accused of a crime while he's already in slavery, so he ends up in jail. He languishes in jail for some time, and eventually God moves him to being one of the most powerful people in all of Egypt, just in time for there to be a 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. And the 7 years of famine are so drastic that they basically make everybody forget about the 7 years of good. They swallow it completely. And the reason that God had for Joseph walking through this entire time of his life to be in this position right as the famine hits is that not only is Joseph able to prepare everyone for the famine, right? He collects a bunch of the grain in Egypt so that people have food during the 7 years of famine. But on top of that, Joseph's own family that sold him into slavery is going to be kept alive, saved, because of Joseph being in that position. So Joseph is going to be the one so far who has the perspective to look at what's happening and know God has a purpose for this. God has a purpose for what is going on, that actually all of this time, this was just about my family being able to stay alive, that God worked this out. Now, last week, just as Joseph is seeing the purpose of all this, he begins a series of tests for his brothers. He basically wants to reconcile with them. He wants to see them in repentance and actually show them the purposes that God has, but he has to see what kind of people they are. So he begins to test them, and we see that the first test is that he keeps Simeon in prison, and he sends the brothers back to go get Benjamin. He says, you will not see my face again until you have come back with your youngest brother, and then we can talk about whether or not you guys are spies, and you can have Simeon back, right, once you prove yourself by bringing this youngest brother. And what we find out is that Simeon is basically just out of luck, right? Because between Simeon and Levi, they are Jacob's two least favorite sons. So basically, as soon as they get back and tell Jacob what's going on, and he weighs Benjamin against Simeon, he's just like, Simeon's dead to me, apparently. And that's it. They leave him in prison. And we're going to see just how much they leave him there this week. Reuben tries to convince Jacob to let them go back, right? But we saw the way that he tried is he said, okay, you've lost 2 sons in this whole process. I'll let you take 2 of mine. He treats it flippantly, like this light trade of, well, sons for sons, right? We'll just make it even, easy peasy. And it's like, you're trivializing the fact that this man has lost 2 sons. He doesn't want to take more people's lives. He wants his sons back. All right. And so right as we start this chapter, what we're going to see is that their food is finally running out and they need to go back anyway just to get food. So look at Genesis 43, starting in verse 1. Now the famine was heavy in the land, and it happened when they had finished eating the grain which they had brought from Egypt, that their father said to them, "Go back, buy us a little food." Judah spoke to him, however, saying, "The man solemnly warned us, saying, 'You shall not see my face unless your brother is with you. If you send our brother with us, we will go down and buy you food. But if you do not send him, we will not go down, for the man said to us, you will not see my face unless your brother is with you.'" Okay, so the first thing I want to point out is just this. They literally stayed in Canaan long enough to eat all the food they brought back, and while Simeon was in prison. At no point were they, are we going to mount a rescue operation? They were just like, we got food, so good luck, Simeon. That's just it for him. Okay, that's how much Simeon plays into this. He literally doesn't matter at all as far as what they're trying to accomplish, right? I told you guys this last week, but when Reuben offered up 2 sons, he offered up 2 sons as the trade for Benjamin and Joseph. Simeon doesn't even factor in as a bargaining tool. That's how much Simeon doesn't matter in this family right now, okay? So they've left him in prison, and Judah, as they run out of food, and Dad says, you guys need to go back because we're out of food, and Judah basically says, we literally can't. If we go back and we don't take Benjamin, it's just going to be worse than it was last time, because we're not going to prove we're not spies. The man's going to think we're lying. He's going to take us all prisoner at that point. We're definitely not going to come back with more food if we don't take Benjamin. So he says, you have to send Benjamin with us. Look at verse 6. Then Israel said, why did you treat me so badly by telling the man whether you still had another brother? But they said, the man questioned particularly about us and our kin, saying, is your father still alive? Have you another brother? So we told him concerning these things. Could we possibly have known that he would say, bring your brother down? Then Judah said to his father Israel, send the boy with me, and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die, we as well as you and our little ones. Okay, so here's the thing that happens here. First of all, Jacob is being his classic victimhood self, right? Jacob just goes, why have you done this to me? And their response is, okay, how on earth were we supposed to know that at the end of this conversation where this guy was being weirdly inquisitive about our family, he was going to go, bring your brother back here? It's like we couldn't possibly have predicted that that's where that conversation was going. It was a weird conversation in the first place, right? Because again, if this isn't Joseph, right? If this isn't their long lost brother, this conversation doesn't make a lot of sense. It's like, why does this guy asking about our dad, asking about our other brother? And so they couldn't have predicted that that's where it's going. But essentially, what Judah says is he reminds Jacob of his own words. He says, send Benjamin with me so we may live and not die. This is a reminder of the theme, essentially, of the gospel. The point of the gospel is that we may live and not die. It is the gift of God that provides for us a way to live. And so in this moment, Judah is reminding Jacob that what matters right now is that we wouldn't all die, right? You either send Benjamin with us, we risk it, or everybody's gone anyway, right? They're on the verge of being snuffed out, essentially. So look at verse 9. I myself will be the guarantee for him. From my hand you may require him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then I shall bear the sin before you all of my days. For if we had not delayed, surely by now we could have returned twice. Okay, now this is very important right here. See, Reuben approached Jacob and made this a flippant issue. He said, well, I'll trade you. I'll trade you sons. Okay? And Reuben, we've seen, he's the firstborn. He's supposed to be the leader. And all we've seen is that his influence is decreasing. He's consistently not able to lead the family, not able to sway, not able to come up with the idea. And even from the first moments of this kind of comparison of Reuben to Judah, the first thing that happens is Reuben intends on saving Joseph when he's been thrown into the pit, but Judah is actually the one that saves Joseph. Now, the interesting part is Judah's not even trying to save Joseph at that point. The options are murder or sell in slavery. And Judah says, well, if it's between those two, we're going to feel guilty if we shed blood, but instead we could get something out of it if we sell him. That's essentially how Judah saves Joseph. But in the very earliest moments where Reuben is incapable of saving Joseph, he doesn't accomplish his plan, Judah actually does. Judah actually leads, and by his leadership, he saves Joseph. Now, let me remind you that the Joseph narratives are not about Joseph. The Joseph narratives are the vehicle by which the story is about Judah. What we're watching here is that Judah is making a transition from literally the ringleader of selling his brother into slavery to the only one who actually is taking responsibility and trying to make things right, trying to be essentially reconciled or redeemed in this. And so in this moment where Reuben basically made this a flippant issue, Judah makes it something way more serious. He goes to Jacob and he says, listen, on behalf of everyone, all our families, all our little ones, living and not dying, you can hold me personally responsible all my days. If I do not bring him back, I will bear the sin. Now, there's just layers of depth to this, right? One layer is the spiritual idea of just the ownership of our own sin, of our own responsibility. You know, sometimes we forget, like, you would have eaten the fruit in the garden. You would have abandoned Jesus on the cross at best, if not being one of the people who nailed him to it, right? We forget to take ownership of the fact that it is our fault. We are the ones bearing the sin and the weight of the world. And then there's just the physical level here, which is Judah is essentially saying, cut me out of your inheritance. Let my family be destitute. Let me bear shame. I mean, shame is a heavy thing in this culture, right? In the ancient Near Eastern culture. And so essentially he's saying, in all of the ways that I can be disadvantaged because of this, let me be disadvantaged because of this, if I do not bring him back. So Judah, he doesn't treat it flippantly. He actually leads, and he ends it by saying, if you had already let us, we could have been back by now. This could already be over, and we're not now on the verge of starving a second time. We could have already brought Simeon back. This is what it looks like to wait until we run dry to go to the Lord. See, the thing that we often do is we get enough spiritual fill-up to kind of be okay for a minute, and then because we don't want to adjust our behaviors, because we don't want to face our own sin or face what God is telling us to do, we essentially just wait it out. It's kind of like just not eating and just being like, well, hopefully I feel full at some point, right? It's this spiritual game we play where we think, if I don't talk to God, I can pretend I don't know what he wants, and then I can keep acting however I want to act. But the reality is, at some point, the starvation comes back around, and you have to face it. You have to essentially live and not die. The alternative is dying instead of living, right? That's what happens when we evade God. Running dry is what leads us to try to plan how to save ourselves, how to take care of ourselves. Look at verse 11. Then their father Israel said to them, if it must be so, then do this. Take some of the best products of the land in your bags and bring them down to the man as a present. A little balm, a little honey, aromatic gum, and myrrh, pistachio nuts, and almonds. Now take double the money in your hand and take back take back in your hand the money that was put back in the mouth of your sacks. Perhaps it was a mistake. And take your brother also. Arise, return to the man. And may God Almighty grant you compassion before the man, so that he will release you to your other brother and Benjamin.
released to you, your other brother and Benjamin. And as for me, if I am bereaved of my children, I am bereaved. So the men took this present, and they took double the money in their hand and Benjamin, and they arose and went down to Egypt and stood before Joseph. Okay, the first thing I want you to see here is what Jacob essentially is doing is he is figuring out how to solve this problem himself. This is classic Jacob. This is just Jacob over and over again in his life. He's always kind of going, okay, how do I navigate this situation to my best possible outcome? And what we've seen over and over again is really that Jacob's essentially proposition, the thing that he comes up with, it either doesn't matter at all or it actually looks just really silly compared to the way that God actually ends up providing. It's when we do this. Have you ever prayed this prayer? Okay, God, here's the deal. Here's what I'm going to give you and expect you to give something back to me. Right? That's not, God doesn't, let's just put it this way. God doesn't need anything you have to offer. He is not in need of you in a way where you have leverage over him by giving him something. Right? And so in this moment, Jacob acting in his classic way, and I want you to see this, he makes a list of the items that they should take back with them. These are kind of luxury items. All right, now there's a comparison going on here. These luxury items that they're taking back to Egypt to give to Joseph, they're describing essentially the same picture of luxury items that they saw in the slave traders, the Midianites that were passing by when they sold Joseph. So there's this moment where they sell out their brother. They are responsible spiritually for his blood because they look at the world and they go, hey, we could gain something. And now in this moment, they apparently have, whether they, this is probably not the items that they sold Joseph for, but in some way, shape, or form, they have some affluence, right? They have luxury items. They have the world. And here's the interesting thing. These items are useless to them in this transaction. Joseph doesn't want this stuff, and none of this stuff matters to Joseph. They have actually nothing to offer. This is what happens when we collect the materialistic things of the world, we build up our storehouses, and we think somehow we have some kind of leverage with God when it comes to our sin. God looks at the things that you think you're offering him, and he's like, you think I need some pistachio nuts from you? That's not going to do it. You don't have what it takes. In this moment, their best attempt is feeble and worthless. And it really puts into perspective how they got themselves in this situation in the first place. They sold their brother out. They hated their brother. They essentially, spiritually in their hearts, have committed murder over now things that can't get them out of the guilt, that can't pay the price for what they are trying to be redeemed of. Jacob says, listen, take double the money, right? Because they had the money put back. Take double the money so that we can pay the debt we had before and any new food we buy. Take Benjamin with you. And then he utters a prayer. And this is interesting because essentially he says, God is in charge. Now, this is new Jacob, right? We've seen spiritual growth in Jacob throughout the entire course of his life. Old Jacob was just like, how do I solve this? And there's still some of that tendency because Jacob's not perfect yet. And yet, in spite of the planning that has remained a tendency of Jacob, he acknowledges God is the one who's in charge here. And what we should be doing is praying for his compassion, his mercy, that he would love us in this. And so Jacob is the first person here to acknowledge outright God is sovereign in this situation, and what God chooses to be the outcome will be the outcome. So they go and they stand before Joseph with this slew of worldly gifts, and they are essentially prepared to make a deal, to make promises and try to fix this problem themselves. My question to you is, when you spend time in prayer, when you spend time in your quiet time, are you actually offering yourself up to God and being in full surrender, or are you actually just figuring out how to get God to do what you want him to do? Are you trying to work a situation out where you can manipulate God into doing the things that you want God to do for you? right? They have gone to stand before God. And when you stand before God someday, the only thing that is going to be worth anything as you stand before God is whether or not you are covered in the blood of Christ. And if you show up with all your worldly accomplishments and possessions and not any of the blood of Christ, you're going to be in a world of hurt. So we see this transition, and as they get close to Joseph, what we're going to see is that they almost compulsively start to try to justify their actions and work their way out of the situation. Look at verse 16. Then Joseph saw Benjamin with them and said to his house steward, "Bring the men into the house and slay an animal and prepare it for the men are to eat with me at noon." So the man did as Joseph said, and he brought the men to Joseph's house. And the men were afraid because they were brought to Joseph's house, and they said, "It is because of the money that was returned in our sacks the first time that we are being brought in, that he may seek occasion against us and fall upon us and take us for slaves with our donkeys." So they came near Joseph's house steward and spoke to him at the entrance of the house, and they said, "O my lord, we indeed came down the first time to buy food. And it happened when we came to the lodging place that we opened our sacks, and behold, each man's money was in the mouth of his sack, our money in full. So we have brought it back in our hand. We have also brought down other money in our hand to buy food. We do not know who put the money in our sacks." Okay. So the first thing is just look at the way they're reacting to the situation, right? They get back and they're being brought in for a time to eat with Joseph, and their thought is he's going to take us slaves and our donkeys, right? And that's like the world's crashing down around them, okay? Everything is going to fail here. And they immediately begin to try to justify themselves really to anybody who will listen. The first person they see is the house steward, and they're like, let's tell him what's going on. Maybe he'll understand and be on our side. Maybe he can explain to the man. Maybe we can kind of get away in here. Right? And so they go, and the reality is, it's like they don't think that this household steward is in communication with Joseph. It's like they expect it to be one way. They'll tell him something, and he'll go, advocate on their behalf. But they don't understand that this servant is clearly aware of what's going on and aware of Joseph's point of view. They immediately try justifying themselves. If you've ever been blamed for anything in your life, what you realize is that the tendency, the natural urge is to not stop telling people why you're not wrong. That is a pride response. That is what pride is. It is, well, I'm not actually at fault. This is actually why I'm the good guy, why I didn't do something wrong. And it's this almost compulsion. And here's what we're missing in this. Maybe you didn't do that thing. And the reason that there's an obsession about justifying yourself about that thing is because you feel like, I'm so guilty of so many things, but this I didn't do, and I got to prove that to everybody involved. And the reality is, it's not about that one thing, right? It's about the sin that we bear in us overall, eternally. Until Christ forgives us of it, replaces us in it, and takes it from us. If you go, well, I may have done all this other stuff, but I didn't do this, who cares? That doesn't matter. That's not a powerful argument. That is missing the point. It's essentially what John says when he says, if we say we have no sin. See, I always point this out to people, that one of the first assurances in the book of 1 John is when John says, if we say we have no sin, we make God a liar. And why is that one of the first assurances? Because all the world is doing all the time is trying to justify themselves. That's it. That's what unbelievers do. They justify sin. That's what pride is. Believers look their sin in the face and go, man, I have sin. And the ironic thing is, it's the people who are constantly seeing their sin and upset about it that think they're not saved because of it. And the reality is, it is seeing your sin and being upset by it that is evidence that you're saved from it. Because if you weren't, all you'd be doing is justifying it. And so in this moment, they are falling into this idea. They just want to prove that they didn't do whatever it is that they're being accused of. And keep in mind, what's really happening from Joseph's perspective? They're worried about, did they steal this money for this grain? They should be worried about the fact that they committed a murder, essentially. Right? But they have sort of connected the dots in like a cosmic way. They've been like, God's clearly after us for this sin in our lives. But they don't go to Joseph and say, sir, we sinned against our God way back, and that's why we think that you're mad at us. No, they're like, no, but we didn't actually steal your money. Like, that's not how it happened. We tried to pay, and the money was just there anyway. And he's like, you're missing the point. You're completely missing the point. Look at verse 23. And he said, be well, do not be afraid. Your God, the God of your father, has given you treasure in your sacks. Your money has come to me. Then he brought Simeon out to them. Then the man brought the men into Joseph's house and gave them water, and they washed their feet, and he gave their donkeys fodder. So they prepared the present for Joseph's coming at noon, for they had heard that they were to eat a meal there. Okay. The servant gives them the most blatant testimony that they've heard so far, and it is now the second person in just this portion of Scripture that is declaring God to be the one in charge of this situation. So now we're up to two. We're up to two times that somebody has said, really, whatever's going to happen here is because God is the one making it happen. He is also the bearer of the author's message. The one true God has given you treasure. He has already provided for you. Now, he then says, I've received your pay. Okay, that phrase is weird, like your money came to me. What he means essentially is, I understand you're telling me that you had the money that you were supposed to pay still in your bags when you left, but I had it accounted for. Essentially, what he's saying is, your debt is gone. The thing that you think you owe, you don't owe anymore. Can I be any more clear with what's being said here? Right? This is the heart of the gospel. This idea that, well, we gotta pay our way. We gotta pay back what we owe. Even more than that, we gotta bring gifts and presents before God. And what we're told essentially in the gospel is, your debt's been paid. Your account, it's been managed. There's no guilt left. There's nothing that you owe on your name or on your sin. So they're being told that the debt has been forgiven. I want you to see this. Their feet is being washed. Right? That's a courtesy to guests. Their donkeys are being fed. An animal has been slaughtered for them to have a meal, and Simeon has been given back to them, and they're still totally missing it. They still don't see what's going on. They're just terrified, and they're constantly trying to justify themselves. And we literally end in verse 25 with them still preparing their measly present. What is the present? What is the gift? It is them. They are what Joseph wants back. He wants his family. He wants his brothers. And they've brought him aromatic gum. That's not what matters. Right? And this is the truth of the gospel. This is why Paul says in Romans 12, it's your own self that you present to God. It is you that are this sacrifice that is pleasing to God. Give yourself up to Him. They are too focused on trying to justify themselves. We often are so focused on trying to justify ourselves. And it's almost as though God is looking down from heaven going, take the free gift. It's free. And I got it just for you so that you could be made right. And all you're supposed to do is give yourself to it. I did a training event where I did like prisoner of war training. And there's a point where we were in a truck and we were not yet, taken prisoners in the scenario. And we could hear people outside of the truck. We were like in a covered like military transport, right? And we could hear the people outside the truck speaking another language. And then we got pulled out of the truck and blindfolds got put on our head and we were taken captive, right? In this training scenario. Well, years later, I went to Latvia on a training mission, and
long story short, the group that I was in, we got rerouted in our plane at some point, and we were in the wrong part of Latvia. And so we got off a plane and met with people who didn't speak English, and they put us on a truck, a covered military transport, and I could hear them talking outside the truck in what sounds just like Russian. And I thought, okay, you're in an allied nation, and that was a training scenario. You're not about to be taken prisoner. But I felt like this is the exact last time this happened, somebody put a bag over my head. Here we are. It's about to happen again. And I had to actually fight that feeling. And what happened really is that the Latvian military was trying to get us back to where we were supposed to go. They took us on troop transports. They were being hospitable. They were looking out for us, and yet I had all the anxiety in the world of being taken prisoner. This is how we treat God. Right? God is looking to protect us and provide for us and watch out for us, and we're acting like He's taking us prisoner, like He's holding us down by the throat. We treat God with this anxiety, and the reality is it's just that the grace that we're receiving is not always obvious to us. It appears to be hidden. Look at verse 26. Then Joseph came home, and they brought into the house to him the present which they had in their hand, and bowed to the ground before him. And he asked them about their well-being, and said, "Is your old father well, of whom you spoke? Is he still alive?" And they said, "Your servant our father is well. He is still alive." They bowed down and prostrated themselves. Then he lifted his eyes and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, and he said, "Is this your youngest brother, of whom you spoke to me?" And they said, "May God be great." And then he said, "May God be gracious to you, son." And Joseph hurried out, for he was deeply stirred with compassion over his brother, and he sought a place to weep. And he entered his chamber, and he wept there. Okay, so Joseph arrives, and it starts out just to be kind of a very cordial thing. He asks about their father again. He asks about the youngest son that he finally finds. And then we see the third acknowledgement that God is the one in charge coming from Joseph. Because Joseph looks at Benjamin and he says, "May God be the one who is gracious to you." So now we are at 3. And if you don't know, 3 is a significant number when it comes to biblical texts, right? The ancient Near Eastern writing styles and the way that the Old Testament is written, you're looking for certain numbers in certain settings. Now, the wrong way to do this is turn to Chronicles and say, "God, how many days until I meet my spouse?" And then just pick the first number you run into, right? That's not how this works. What it is that there are certain culturally significant numbers in the Bible, 3, 7, things like this, right? 40, okay? So in this moment, the repetition of 3 is a theme that's moving through this passage as the author is essentially using the mouths of different people in the story to say, God is the one in charge, right? The other theme that we've seen through the entire Joseph narrative is the repetition in 2s. There's dozens of times that you see 2s. Have you ever read a Bible story and you read a portion that's like recounted a certain way and it's like this happened, then this happened, then this happened. And then you move like half a chapter over and somebody else is like, well, first this happened, this happened, this happened. It's the exact same thing. That's not on accident. There's always a reason that the author is putting that in. Well, the theme in the Joseph narratives has been given to us. We've been told by Joseph himself, God does things in this passage, in this narrative. He's saying God does things in 2s to show it's going to happen. God's already decided He's the one in charge. So we see that that's the theme running through this passage. God has determined everything that is going on here. He's providing every step of the way. And now, as we near what's going to be the centerpiece, right? Next week is actually going to be kind of the highlight chapter of the Joseph narratives. And as we near that, right before we get to that point, we're reminded from 3 different people in the story, God is the one in charge. God is the one providing here. And then I want you to see what happens. Jacob started this passage by asking God to give His compassion. And in this moment, Joseph, as he sees his brother, he has to leave the room because he is burdened and weighed down by the compassion he feels towards him. The author is showing you that this is not just in and of Joseph like by himself. He doesn't just have this much care for his brothers. It is an answer to prayer as God Himself
intervenes and weighs Joseph down with the compassion that he needs to feel for his family. It comes directly from the Lord. God is providing in this moment the compassion that Jacob has asked for. And Joseph, he goes into a private room and he weeps. I read another connection this week, as an author said, it's the tears of Joseph and the washing of the feet of his brothers that are important. See, Joseph is stirred to compassion and weeping and the debt being forgiven of his brothers, and they're being provided for. Their feet is being washed. Their penalty is being cleansed from them in pretty much every figurative way you can see. The redemption of their brother, the slaughtering of an animal, the washing of feet, everything you can think of that points to some kind of illustration or analogy to what's happening in the gospel is present in this chapter. It is the tears of Jesus Christ for you. It is his love for you that drove him to a place where your debt is able to be forgiven. Right? There's this moment, right, where Jesus starts washing the feet of the disciples, and Peter's like, no way. No way am I letting this happen, because you're the one we're supposed to all be aiming towards, and we're supposed to be washing your feet. And Jesus says to him, if I don't wash your feet, you won't make it. You can't be with me. And Peter says, okay, then I give up. Wash every inch of me. I'll take whatever you're going to give me. I just want to be with you. This is exactly the imagery and the illustration. Do you realize that you should be prostrating yourself face down on the ground at every moment of every day, begging God for forgiveness, but instead, Jesus Christ is washing you. He's serving you. If that doesn't drive you to serve him, then you're the person that Paul talks about when he says, what, is Jesus supposed to die again? There's nothing left. There's nothing beyond this. Jesus has died to save you. He has served you in the ultimate way that he can serve you. If you don't respond to that by serving him, there's not more. There's not an additional step to the gospel. It's that simple. In this moment, they are being washed while he is weeping. And then we see the grace that's not hard to see start manifest, the actual obvious grace. Look at verse 31. Then he washed his face and came out, and he restrained himself and said, set the meal. So they set the meal for him by himself, and for them by themselves, and for the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat bread with the Hebrews, for that is an abomination to the Egyptians. And they were seated before him, the firstborn according to his birthright, and the youngest according to his youth. And the men looked at one another in astonishment. Okay, now this is an interesting thing that happens here. There's literally a beautiful picture of essentially, you could almost see it like as Judgment Day if you wanted to, right? It's not like a one-for-one on that, but there's a picture going on here, right? See, what we know, and we see this in other parts of the Bible, is that the Egyptians, they were too good to eat with the Israelites, right? They were too good. That's why when all of Jacob's family finally moves to Egypt, they're given like the land of Goshen. Essentially, they're treated like hillbillies, like those gross, weird people that are sheep herders, right? That nasty job that no dignified person would ever be a sheep herder, right? And so they send them out and they say, you guys go live in Goshen and just don't be in my same marketplace with me, right? And so essentially there's this pride and resentment, a disgust or a detesting of Israel by the Egyptians. And so what you have here is you have a picture of the world eating by itself, God's children eating by themselves. And the interesting thing is, Joseph is not eating at their table or their table. He is separate. Remember, Joseph right now, he is the picture type of Jesus Christ. And he is eating at his own table. He is separate from both, except that one of these groups appears, by what we have in the narrative, to be completely indifferent to what's going on around them. The Egyptians are like, at least we don't have to eat with any of these Israelites, including Joseph, who is essentially providing for them too. They're eating at his house, they're eating his food, they're being provided for by him, and they can't even eat at the same table with him. Even he is disgusting to them. And in the meantime, the brothers who are not fully reconciled with Joseph yet, they're eating separately as well, except that they're being provided for even more lavishly. And we're going to see what Joseph does here, but this is a picture of the world that has at best an indifference towards Christ and definitely a hatred towards his children, even while Jesus himself is providing for them and is making it possible for them to stay alive and to eat. And yet, meanwhile, he's providing for his children. It says that they were astonished, and there's alarmed or shocked. There's several different ways to look at this. What I want you to see here is what they're astonished by is they think something has just happened that's a coincidence. And keep in mind, they're still so on edge. They're just like spooked by everything. So Joseph has them seated in order of birthright, okay, oldest to youngest, and there's no way that he should know that, right? And so what happens is essentially they see that they're seated in accordance with the way they should be seated by honor, and they're like, well, that is spooky. How did that happen? What a coincidence. Because it's like stuff happens in our lives that is obviously and clearly the manifestation of God's will in a miraculous way, and we're like, man, coincidences are wild. And in this moment, and how much do we do that? Not only do we do that, but we even take it in a negative way. It's like, wow, I can't believe that happened. Must be a bad omen. Right? And that's not in the Christian lingo. The idea for us is God's in charge. Of course there's not a coincidence here. Of course he knows things we didn't tell him. He knows everything. And that's essentially what's happening right here. They're astonished, they're alarmed because of this crazy coincidence that happens right in front of them. And then look at the last verse. And he took portions to them from his own table, but Benjamin's portion was 5 times greater than any of theirs, so they feasted and drank freely with him. He took portions to them from his own table. Not just it's all his food, they're in his house, he's providing generally, but he actually took food off of his plate, and he took it and he put it on their plates. It's not just that God is providing generally for you, especially if you're a believer. It's not that, the rain just falls on the just and the unjust. It's that God is actually taking portions off of his own plate that you could inherit it with him. He's given you, and here's the crazy part, it's not even that he's taking portions off of something he owns. The portion is himself. Jesus gives himself to you as a portion. You're being lavishly loved on. You're being poured over with the very gift you need the most. How does this story literally end in this chapter? It is that they feasted and drank freely with him. See, we're going to spend our whole lives trying to figure out how to justify ourselves, trying to figure out how to pay our own way, make right what's been wrong, to prove that even though we did all those other horrible things, we didn't do this one horrible thing, only to miss out on the fact that God is giving us a free gift, a portion of himself, that we might just be with him. And that being with him might be the single greatest gift we could possibly get. You are being given God-given treasure. If you're sitting in this room, it may be news to you in that you're not listening, but it's not news to you in that it's not being said, because that's every time you open your Bible, God is trying to tell you about the God-given treasure. Every time you hear a sermon, every time you go to your life group, we're talking about the fact that God is giving us a free gift of himself. And when you see that, when you realize all that he's done, And then you have to essentially realize what Judah realized in this passage. I don't have anything to give you, but myself. I'll be the offering. I'll be the gift. Judah's starting to get it, right? Because he looked at the situation with Jacob and he didn't say, well, I'll pay you back for the sons you lost. He says, okay, I'll be at fault. He admits responsibility. Your job is not to spend all your time spinning out on how do I prove I'm not as bad as somebody might think, or as bad as I think I am. But instead, how do I give myself fully and completely to God? How do I experience the gospel because I sell out and surrender to this 100%? This week, as you go out, ask yourself, when was the last time that you expressed true gratitude and thanksgiving to the Lord for what He's already doing, for what He's already done? Not hyper fixated and focused on the most immediate problem. Even knowing that even that problem is under God's sovereignty. And He's aware of it and He's taking care of it. Go out this week and try to acknowledge in your spirit the God-given treasure that you've already received.
Hey guys, this is Philip Jackson, pastor to young adults at Evergreen Baptist Church. I want to invite you to come to Reach. We meet every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. at Evergreen Church in South Tulsa, just east of Mingo on 111th Street. The mission of Reach Tulsa is to cultivate a young adult community that's defined by real transformation and the sincere pursuit of a godly life through training in biblical disciplines, personal development, and intentionally transitioning into independence as mature members of the body of Christ. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like and subscribe to our content. We're available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Reach Young Adult Ministry is a part of Evergreen Baptist Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma. For more information and additional lessons, please visit our website, evergreenbc.org.